I spoke of representative democracy initially. What I had really in mind was classical liberal democracy, vulnerabilities, and resiliency. In the mid-1980s, a friend and colleague of mine who died, unfortunately, a few years ago, a philosopher by the name of Pierre Asner, a French from Romanian descent, coined the expression of competitive decadence. And he applied it to the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s. And of course, in terms of decadence, the Soviet Union was unbeatable and disappeared a few years after Pierre Asner coined that sentence. But I'm reminded of his expression while looking at the competition between democracy and authoritarianism in the first quarter of the 21st century. There is a tendency to say, which is favored, of course, by the speeches by Putin and the words of Xi Jinping, that democracy is in the wane, that authoritarianism is much more modern, much more efficient. I mean, in the Financial Times, Putin declared that democracy was simply obsolete. And it is the point of my presentation to say that, in fact, it is much more complex than that, and that there is a real balance of strength and weaknesses between those two competing forces. I'm a specialist of geopolitics, and I will start my presentation by linking the crisis of liberal democracy with the crisis of the West. The West is no longer what the West used to be. It is therefore logical that the model created, carried, defended by the West should not be in the best of position. What we are witnessing is, in geopolitical terms, the equivalent of a tectonic shift, a kind of change that occurs every 2, 3, or 4 centuries. For the first time, at least since the end of the 18th century, the West has lost the monopoly for models. And it is therefore absolutely natural that the model of the West should be in difficulties. To put it more precisely, we are faced with what I would describe with the encounter between two moments. And it is the encounter between these two moments that place the crisis of democracy into its proper historical context. The first moment has been described by historians as the Jacksonian moment of the United States. Andrew Jackson was the 7th president of the United States between 1829 and 1836. And his presidency has been characterized around 3 keywords: nationalism, isolationism, and unilateralism. And of course, these 3 words can ring a bell to you. America first, America alone. It's no wonder why Trump has been called the Jacksonian president of the 21st century. But in fact, it is important for our purpose to realize that this Jacksonian moment has started before Donald Trump and will probably go beyond him, even if he's not re-elected in November 2020. There is in the American attitude towards the world an intention to withdraw upon oneself, which in fact goes against the universalist vision of America that supported so much, for the best most of the time, sometimes for the worse, the causes of democracy in the world. And at the very moment America was entering what I had described as its Jacksonian moment, China has entered what we would call the Wilhelminian moment of China. I had an illustration, a hint of what that would mean in the World Economic Forum in Davos in the very beginning of the 2000s, when a close friend of mine, a Chinese advisor to the president of China, came to me during the meeting and said, I'm at a loss. I don't understand why I've been asked to gather information on German diplomacy between 1890 and 1914. Do you understand what it means? And not being a genius, but simply being a European, I said, of course, they want to know what is the best model for them. Is it the Bismarckian model? The stronger you are, the more you have to keep a low profile? Or is it the Wilhelm II model? Now the world must know that we are making it, and they should understand our strength and deal with us adequately. And it's clear that the Chinese have moved from the Bismarckian model to the Wilhelm II model, with the idea that at the very moment the United States are withdrawing on themselves, the Chinese are expanding, and not only expanding through their commercial strength, strategic strength, diplomatic initiative, but through a sense of confidence within their model. It is the first time an empire civilization, convinced that it was the first to emerge in world history, that is re-emerging and not emerging. China is back, and the Chinese model is back as a source of strong competition towards the dysfunctioning of the Western model, exemplified by the United States. And so, in a way, the Chinese could say to themselves, there are two models that do not work. The Russian one, trying to make political reform before economic reform, and the American model. And to a large extent, two things happen which confirm the Chinese into the validity of their criticism of the Western democratic model. The first one was the events of 2007, 2008, 2009, the financial crisis of the West that led 10 years later, less than 10 years later, to the Brexit referendum in Great Britain, followed by a few months later by the election of Donald Trump into the United States. And so they had the confirmation in their mind that the West was no longer a model from an economic, capitalistic point of view. They do it badly, but also from a political point of view. Democracy does not work. If someone like Donald Trump can be the president of the United States, it is the absolute proof that we are in the right direction and that they have been moving in the wrong direction. And this is where I move to my second point, which to my mind is at least as important as the first one. The geopolitical evolution, which led to the sense of growing confidence of the non-democratic regimes, was beefed up, strengthened by the socio-economic, ethical crisis of the West. And from that standpoint, I think democracy has been threatened above all by the explosion of inequalities that took place between 1970 and today. To give you one figure that stuck in my mind, in 1970, the difference between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid one in an average American firm was between 40 to 1. In 2007, it was between 400 to 1. In 2016, it was 600 to 1. This evolution has been denounced by the French economist Thomas Piketty. I don't share the conclusion he derives from his analysis, but you cannot simply dismiss the figures he gives. This explosion of inequalities is eating up at the cohesiveness of the social consensus. How can you speak of a society when someone makes 600 times more than most of the people surrounding him? It's simply impossible. And it creates a process which has been aggravated by the failure of the elite to find solution to the problem they had created. In 2007, the infectious greed of the financial industry led to the ruin of their customers. But the bankers themselves emerge largely intact. And you go back to a principle that reminded you of the French Revolution. Why are these privileges in our system if those who are privileged do not justify this privilege by the action they are creating? And I think going back to those two events which I mentioned, the Brexit referendum and the American election, you find in them the same combination between three key words: anger, fear, and nostalgia. There is anger, I mentioned that, at the elite. You betrayed us all. The rejection of the experts, the so-called people who know and who clearly do not know, because if they knew, they would find solutions. Fear, which is very much linked to a loss of confidence in yourself, and the combination between the opening of boundaries and the loss of confidence in oneself leads directly to the rise of populist, anti-immigrant forces and an ethnic kind of nationalism, of rejection of the other, that is very present. And there is that third word, which I think is important, and that is the word nostalgia. Except you are not nostalgic of classical liberal democracy. You are nostalgic of the empire in the British case. You are nostalgic in the American case of a period where blue collars were part of the middle class and not nearly the small whites that feel left alone from the process of society. And I think the third dimension beyond geopolitics, beyond socio-economic factors, are ethical factors. I think the coming of corruption, the explosion of corruption, following these two trends, was, in a way, the last nail in the possible coffin of that system. You can accept everything from the very rich, but you cannot accept the corruption that is so blatant, so open. It creates simply a sense of explosion. And the elite are deeply guilty from that standpoint. There is, I would say, in the Western world, a sense of arrogance towards all those who are not part of the elite, or towards all those who are not part of your culture. Even in the case of Eastern and Central Europe, we came to their help, but with a sense of arrogance. I do remember at some point a French president telling a Polish president, I'm fed up with your speech. You should act and stop speaking. That's 2003. The Poles had been buying American military equipment and not French military equipment. But now when you look at the evolution of Eastern and Central Europe, at their rejection of an imitative model, you have to understand that we do carry a sense of responsibility for what we are witnessing in front of us. The rise of illiberal democracy carried by personalities such as Orban in Hungary didn't come by accident. I mean, the famous sentence of Viktor Orban when he said, yesterday, the European Union was our future. Today, we are the future of the European Union. That sense of diffidence towards us is, in large part, the product of our arrogance towards them. And while we were arrogant towards them, we were complacent vis-à-vis ourselves. We didn't try to do the reform we should have been trying to implement. And this combination between arrogance and complacency should give way to a combination of modesty and ambition. But can we do it? This is the question that is raised. So the crisis of classical liberal democracy is real and deep. But that does not mean that the victory of the authoritarian system is around the corner. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama spoke of the end of history. It was a premature sentence. We've seen that. All those who are today the prophets of doom and gloom and who speak of the end of democracy are, I believe, as premature in their analysis than Francis Fukuyama was in his analysis nearly 30 years ago. Why is it so? Why is it so? I think if you look at the two challenges that will be symbolizing the next month's evolution, the election in the United States and the fate of Hong Kong, you see in symbolic terms the nature of the problem. Donald Trump is not yet the next president of the United States. A defeat of Donald Trump, which is a significant possibility, would transform the way we look at democracies. The victory, the triumphant victory of Boris Johnson yesterday is also the proof that history is more complex. Is it a victory for populism? Is it a victory for democracy? Is Boris Johnson an anti-Trump, or is Boris Johnson preceding the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States? It's very unclear. What I'm sure of is that the challenges authoritarian regime are faced with are much more significant than what they believe, and we are much more resilient than what they think. Let's start with the case of Hong Kong. Chinese are saying openly every day that democracy is on the wane. Well, in Hong Kong, we had 800,000 people in the street last Sunday, as many people as French citizens in the streets, for a population nearly 10 times smaller. Initially, they were willing to risk their life for the maintenance of the rule of law. Now they are willing to risk their life for the coming of democracy. The reforms made in time weakened the revolutionary spirit, used to say Cavour, the founder of the Italian unity. Well, reforms made too late are increasing the revolutionary spirit. This is what we are witnessing in front of our eyes in Hong Kong. And I think, to a large extent, the Chinese are in a complete dilemma. They don't know what to do. They are aware of the fact that there is a gap, a discrepancy between the slowing down of their economic growth and the rise of their foreign policy ambitions. They know that they may be running the risk of repeating the mistakes of the Soviet Union after having denounced them, i.e., to spend too much on security and diplomacy compared to their global strength. At the same time, they can't send tanks into the streets of Hong Kong. You cannot see a repetition of Tiananmen. Their ultimate goal is to make sure that by the middle of the 21st century, Taiwan will be back. And they are deeply aware of the fact that whatever they are doing in Hong Kong goes against their primary ambition. What is valid for China is even more so for Russia. Russia has returned with a vengeance thanks to the gap left by the United States. But at the same time, Russia is punching well above her means, does not have the ability to replace the United States in the Middle East, for example. In fact, I was very struck by the fact that being in Doha, Qatar, a month ago, the guest of the Emir of Qatar, he never spoke of Europe as if Europe didn't exist any longer. He barely spoke of Russia. He spoke mostly of the United States leaving and the Chinese coming. That was the big evolution in his mind. Now, let me, because time is moving fast, what I wanted to say in my presentation was that democracies are much more resilient up to a point than we think they are. Of course, they can be broken and have to be handled with care. But if you look at the evolution in the world today, the demonstrations that are taking place from Lebanon to Iraq, from Chile to Algeria, not to mention again and repeat Hong Kong, you see that people are willing to risk their life for principle. They are not satisfied with the mixture of authoritarianism, corruption, and inefficiency that lead their life. In fact, there is the case of Lebanon and Algeria are very interesting from the problematic we have in front of our eyes. In Lebanon, you see people taking to the streets in the name of Lebanon. Let's transcend our confessional division. We are one people. They speak in the streets of Beirut using the sentences that the Germans in Eastern Germany used in 1989. We are a people. In Algeria, they refused to vote in a masquerade of presidential election because they know the system has not changed and will not change. And so to a large extent, I'm slightly optimistic by the very fact that at the moment, authoritarian regimes are declaring that history has a meaning and it goes in their direction. You have the experience all over the world of just the opposite evolution. What direction will it take? I don't know. I think we are faced with two, in fact, historical processes. One that is a long-term one, the long cycle of geopolitics, which goes in the direction of Asia by opposition in the direction of the West. But there is a second cycle, a much shorter one. And from that standpoint, history has not yet decided. The moderates, like myself, may look like the moderates of the 1930s. Maybe everything I said is just hopeful thinking, intuition, feelings to make me feel good when I think of my granddaughters. But maybe not. And a month ago, I had to give the commencement speech at the University of Lüneburg in Germany. And I said to the students, if I had given that speech 30 years ago, we would all be in a mood of exhilaration. We would be celebrating the fall of the wall, the triumph of liberty. Today I'm coming to you in a much somber mood. But it's great. It means your generation has a responsibility to prove the prophets of doom wrong and the optimistic right. We'll see. Thank you very much.